Welcome back to another episode of Signals Over Noise, the show where we take news from around the world and strip it of the headlines and the partisan punditry. That way we can see the signals that actually matter. And this week gave us no shortage of signals to choose from, whether that was instability in Cuba, economic recession in South America, or the ongoing war in the Middle East. Which is why this week we'll use the same framework as last week. We'll start in North America, where we will give the highlights of President Trump's State of the Union address. Then we'll move south, where economic instability seems to be the defining signal out of South America. Then we'll travel across the Pacific and examine how great power competition is shaping the strategic environment. Arriving in Africa, where the United Nations is using very alarming language to describe the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Then we'll enter the trenches of the Ukraine in Europe, where the war against Russia has entered its fifth continuous year. Then we'll end in the region that has defined U.S. foreign policy for generations, the Middle East. But speaking of U.S. policy, we have to go back to last Tuesday, when President Trump delivered his State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress and other U.S. government officials. And there were several highlights from the speech, including recognition of the U.S. men's hockey team for winning Olympic gold against Canada in overtime. The first time that this has happened since the Miracle on Ice in the 1980s. At the same time, two extraordinarily deserving warriors from different generations and different conflicts were presented with the Medal of Honor. But beyond the spectacle, there were serious signals that came out of the State of the Union address, which anchored itself in the economic and security achievements the administration has achieved over the last 12 months, most notable of which is the southern border crisis and Western Hemisphere stability. And this isn't just rhetoric coming out of the State of the Union. It's also enshrined in the 2025 update to the National Security Strategy and the 2026 update to the National Defense Strategy, which places border security and Western Hemisphere stability as the number 1 and 2 lines of effort, respectively. During the speech, President Trump called on Mexico to ramp up its efforts against the cartel and drug trafficking into the United States. While at the same time, other U.S. officials have alluded to the possibility that in the future, U.S. forces could accompany Mexican security forces in their operations against the cartel. And this is a marked difference between what the Mexican president has described as just an internal security issue, stressing the importance of sovereignty in the country of Mexico. But speaking of Mexico and their operations against the cartel, we also have to travel back to 2 Sundays ago. And we did a longer episode on this, so I'll just give you the cliff notes. But not last Sunday, but the Sunday before, Mexican security forces conducted an operation targeting the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And during this operation, their leader, Nemesio Cervantes, otherwise known as El Mencho, was killed during the raid. And the response from the cartel was immediate. No doubt you've probably seen videos on social media when cartel gunmen took to the street, established roadblocks, and began burning vehicles and buildings to the ground. Mexico immediately deployed its military and National Guard to the surrounding areas to reestablish order and stability in those regions. But that's not the only crisis that was ongoing in North America last week. At the same time, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a humanitarian crisis is beginning to develop in the island nation of Cuba. And let me give you some background on Cuba in case you're not familiar with what's been going on there over the last several weeks. Following our raid in January that captured President Maduro of Venezuela, Venezuela stopped exporting oil to Cuba. And this has caused an energy and oil crisis in the country. This has led to rolling blackouts, and last week, Havana issued a statement saying that it was no longer going to be collecting trash in the capital city. Well, at the same time last week, the U.S. Embassy on the island issued a statement to its staff and employees telling them that they should conserve whatever fuel they have, try to maintain as high of a charge on their phone as they can at all times, and to prepare for instability in protests across the nation. And this is important, because it might not immediately seem to everybody else that a humanitarian crisis is developing in Cuba, but when a country can no longer provide basic civil services to its citizens, instability and crisis quickly follows. And whenever instability and crisis hit Cuba, it leads to an increase in migration to Florida and other coastal states from the island. And that's something we need to watch out for at this time. If I was to take the signals from the State of the Union, from Mexico and from Cuba, and give strong analysis, I would say two things. The first is that the United States is shifting its focus from abroad over to the Western Hemisphere specifically, while at the same time, the continent of North America is quickly becoming less stable. But speaking of instability, let's travel to South America, where the defining signals coming out of the continent this week all center around the economy. We'll start in Venezuela. Last week, we talked about how Francis Donovan, the commander of U.S. Southern Command Forces, visited Caracas and had a meeting with the interim leadership of Venezuela, marking a new chapter in the relations between the United States and the country. This week, we're focusing on the economic signals coming out of the nation. Venezuela is still facing a crisis of hyperinflation, and it recently canceled 19 different contracts in its oil industry. And this isn't the only country in South America that's facing economic hardship. The largest country in the region, and arguably the most important, Brazil, is also beginning to face economic hardship as well. Brazil was hit hard by the Liberation Day tariffs that were imposed by President Trump's administration last year, and we're beginning to see the results of those tariffs in real time. Brazil was expecting to see a 4% growth of its GDP last quarter, and instead it only saw a 2% growth, which is indicating the likelihood that an economic recession may be coming towards that country. And I want to make myself very clear here. What is bad for Brazil is bad for the rest of the countries in the region. Brazil doesn't just have the largest population and the largest land mass or the largest economy in South America. It's also one of the largest importers and exporters for its surrounding neighbors. And any time that something happens in Brazil that's bad for their country, it's also bad for the surrounding countries in the region. And speaking of countries surrounding Brazil, we also saw last week the ignition of a trade war between Ecuador and Colombia, with each country placing escalatory tariffs against each other. Now, taken separately, each of these signals might not mean much, but when we take them all together and we analyze them, we see a couple of defining features in the South American continent. The first of which is that each of these countries appears to be going at it alone. We're not seeing a unified front amongst them, and that's not typically good for the economy of South America. The second signal that we're seeing is renewed U.S. engagement in the region, showing that it's not just words in the State of the Union or our national security strategy or defense strategy, but we're actually following through with those actions. Only time will tell how competition will shape South America. But let's travel now to a region of the world where competition is actively shaping the environment. The Indo-Pacific. Last week, we talked about new deployments of U.S. forces and equipment to the island of the Philippines. And this week, we saw another development out of the Philippines as well. The United States, the Philippines, and other regional actors participated in joint naval exercises in the South China Sea, signaling that the United States is continuing to build partner force capability and capacity by developing our interoperability and synchronization with partners in the region. This is centered around the third line of effort of the National Defense Strategy, which is to deter Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And speaking of Chinese aggression in the region, we continue to see an increase of gray zone military activities as China is beginning to become closer to its 2027 military readiness deadline for a potential invasion of Taiwan. And like I said last week, and I've said several times, China having a 2027 deadline for military readiness does not mean that in 2027, China is going to invade Taiwan. It signals that the government of China has placed a requirement on its military just to be ready by then. Despite this, China continues to ramp up its information and cognitive and psychological operations in the region as well. When Filipino officials traveled to one of the islands inside of their economic exclusion zone off their coast, they were met with text messages on their phones saying, "Welcome to China." China does not seem to be slowing down its actions in the Indo-Pacific, and neither does the United States and its allies. Taking all of these signals together, there is one unusually clear and defining signal, and that is that this region continues to be one of the largest shaping environments in the world and could realistically be the site of the United States' next major conflict against a near-peer power. Moving away from the Indo-Pacific, though, we enter the continent of Africa, where last week we heard some very alarming language out of the UN as it was describing the ongoing conflict in Sudan. The United Nations Council on Human Rights says that the situation in Sudan is quickly beginning to become a genocide. And that is very alarming language coming from the organization, which as part of its charter when it was stood up, was to prevent any future genocides from ever happening. And of course, it hasn't done that. There have been several genocides around the world since its creation. However, none of those were defined as genocides by the United Nations, which makes this statement all the more concerning. And the continent of Africa is becoming increasingly more unstable. Policy analysts said that in the Sahel region of Africa between 2024 and 2025, that Islamic State and jihadist activity had increased by over 90%. This report published last week is concerning because we also talked about last week the deployment of 100 U.S. troops to the country of Nigeria to support their operations and advise them. Now, they're not there in the capacity to conduct combat operations. They're there mostly for training and advising. However, the question still remains is if the increase of militant activity in the region will spare them from any violence or harm. To take the signals out of Africa this week, it's pretty clear and simple. Africa is increasingly becoming unstable, and we may be witnessing a genocide unfolding in the country of Sudan, and that is being overshadowed by the conflict in the Middle East. It is nonetheless important for us to watch. Also, an important thing for us to watch traveling north in the continent of Europe is the anniversary of the war between Russia and Ukraine. This operation started in February of 2022. This was its 4th anniversary, and we're moving on to our 5th continuous year of conflict in the region. Right now, there seems to be a stalemate still between Ukraine and Russia, with very little territory lost or gained. We did see an offensive operation late last year, early this year, that saw Russia gain some territory, but it seems to be now that Ukraine has reclaimed most of it, and the lines remain at a stalemate. This has had widespread ramifications in the continent of Europe, and there have been several chances for Russia and Ukraine to achieve peace. The most recent ones from earlier this year met no resolve to the conflict. Even with Ukraine being willing to concede some of its territory, Russia was unwilling to make a deal with the country. And notably out of this conflict is Russia's evolving way they have framed this conflict. It started out in 2022 as Russia reclaiming ethnically Russian territory inside of the Ukraine. And then the conflict became broader and was expanded as Russia fighting against NATO aggression in Europe. And that has been the defining framework for the last several months. Russia views this conflict as a conflict not just against the Ukraine, but also against NATO and its allies in the region. Notably, though, after the release of the Epstein files earlier this year, the Kremlin started to describe the conflict in Ukraine as something more. They also started to describe it as a war against the Western banking system as a whole. Now, that is extraordinarily unique because that was never mentioned in 2022, 2023, 24, or 25 prior to the release of the Epstein files. This shows that our adversaries are willing and able to use political scandal in the United States and the Western world to gain cheap influence points when it has its conflicts abroad. But speaking of conflicts abroad, it's time to address the elephant in the room. The region of the world that has defined U.S. policy for generations, the Middle East. On Friday evening, we saw the start of kinetic operations by the United States and Israel against Iran. And I did an emergency episode just on that where we deep dived that. I'm also doing daily updates several times a day over the evolving situation, especially within the first 72 hours. So I'm not going to go too in depth with that right now. What I do want to focus on, though, is broader tensions in the region that might be missed because of our operations. And that is, of course, the ongoing war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Last week, Pakistan's defense minister came out and said that they were in an open conflict with Afghanistan. The Pakistani Air Force hit several targets in the country of Afghanistan, and the Taliban forces in Afghanistan have retaliated. There appears to be open conflict on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that just adds fuel to the fire of an already tense region. Despite this, though, there were some defining features that came out of Afghanistan that were a little surprising. For example, the Taliban offered the use of Bagram Air Force Base to the United States. And that's kind of funny. But as of right now, it does not seem we've taken them up on that offer. They've also declared their support for kinetic operations against Iran. And that goes to show you the deep divide between Shia and Sunni Muslims in the Middle East. Outside of those tensions, it also appears that Al-Qaeda, one of the defined enemies of the United States in the region, has declared their support of the United States against Iran and has stated that they will help in any way that they can. So as of right now, it appears that the United States and Israel are not just aligned against Iran, but they're also aligned with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban against Iran as well, which just goes to show how geopolitically complex this region of the world is. Now, this week, as we're recording this episode, Congress is debating the War Powers Resolution, and we have yet to see any sort of movement on whether they're going to vote to limit or expand operations in this region. However, we do know this, that as of Monday, while we're recording this, the United States has recommended that across the Middle East, any U.S. citizens that are in the area should immediately evacuate. This, coupled with the president's warning earlier today that the United States hasn't even begun to strike Iran, is concerning. It shows that escalation is likely and imminent in this region. And at this time, we don't know what that might look like. We do know that Israeli forces started to bomb border crossings between Iran and Iraq, shaping the environment for a potential ground force invasion. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to use ground forces, but it does show that we're setting the conditions for the use of ground forces in the region. And that would mark a significant escalation in this conflict. Also, since we posted our last update in the war in the Middle East, it appears that 2 more U.S. service members have been killed in the region, bringing the total number of dead for the United States up to 6. This would be a good moment for all of us to pray for the U.S. service members and the people of the Middle East during this time of crisis and war. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at the crisis in the war in the Middle East with an especially careful eye. You can expect to see lots of updates for us, including most likely this weekend, we'll do a longer deep diving episode to try and see if our framework can show us which direction we're going to go in this conflict. Until then, focus on the signals, ignore the noise. This has been Signals Over Noise.